Well guys, this is the big topic, isn't it? Something people have been arguing over since Shadow the Hedgehog. As for some, it was the start of the crazy ups and downs for the series. And of course I'm talking about Shadow the Hedgehog the game, not the character, so don't get too mad. Sega really gotta stop with their confusing game titles. Between that, Sonic 06, and Sonic Boom, you'd think the Sonic creators would forget what year they're in. Fellow and Sonic employee, don't we already have a game called Sonic the Hedgehog? Which princess should I put in this one? But anyway, for a while it looked like we were in the clear when we got great games like Sonic Colors and Sonic Generations. But with Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric, the Sonic series lost its footing and made a lot of people question, again, if we would ever get that one Sonic game that we all want. For some, it's the ever-evasive Sonic Adventure 3. Some long for the days of the Genesis, with a new two-dimensional title that can rival games such as Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic 2, and Sonic 3. Heck, some people actually think that Sonic turning 3D is what killed him. Are you nuts? Anyway, to be honest, it's hard to say just how a company can go from classic games like Sonic the Hedgehog, and a few years later see that same Hedgehog with the sword and armor fighting King Arthur. Sonic has taken on so many forms, and it really makes you wonder what it is that caused this crazy roller coaster. Sure, a lot of people would blame the developers, the fans' influence, or companies like Cryware, but I think that we're kinda looking at it the wrong way. In the end, all of the mood swings that Sonic's gone through, all the changes in developers, and styles, and all the different gameplay that they've added in, all has to be okayed by Sega. It all comes back to the whys and whos of Sega itself, and just why they chose to make some of the choices that they did. A lot of people have come to this conclusion, and some of them simply said, well, we'll never know. We're not gonna waltz into Sega's headquarters and say, what were you thinking? Although I have heard they have at least 3 people doing that every day. But I think it seems adequate to take a slightly different and more hands-on approach. In each of the choices and forms that Sega has taken, we're given clues as to why. There are actually apparent reasons for games like Shadow the Hedgehog and Sonic 06 to exist. And I'm not just talking about why or how they turned out bad, I'm talking about, to some extent, looking at the games not as they are, but how they were supposed to be. It's not something that takes a scientist to see. Sonic 06 has patterns, not only in design, but also in presentation. A few small yet well-done reoccurrences that show just what Sega was trying to do, and maybe why they had Sonic kiss a human. You may think it's insanity that someone thought it would be okay to have Sonic kiss a human in Sonic 06. But by the end of this video, maybe not so much. Actually, no, it's still insanity, but you get my point. So just what am I talking about? What are these clues to help us figure out what's going on in the decision-making room of Sega? Well, it's time to analyze the entire Sonic franchise, to see just where their minds were and put some logic as to the whys and hows. Believe it or not, this could actually give some good estimation on whether or not Sega will give us that Sonic Adventure 3 or next great Genesis-styled title. It's time to see if Sega will actually rise from grace once more, and we have to start all the way back in the 1990s. In today's market, Nintendo is in competition with Microsoft and Sony in the so-called console wars. But as most of you know, the 90s was a very different kind of war. Today, our main competitors aren't really competitive at all. They respect each other and aren't at all in any sort of gripe with their competitors. Yeah, a lot of die-hard fans will say otherwise, but in our modern age, they just want to get along. I mean, maybe it's just an act to seem peaceful or cool, but maybe it's how they really feel. Either way, things back in the day were very different. Now, I didn't have the privilege of actually being alive back in the 90s to experience this, but I've heard stories on the internet from veterans of gaming, telling us of those times as if they're our grandfather telling us about World War II. The war of the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo was all very evenly split between gamers. Those were the days where you couldn't just say, well, I'll get both. No, you had to choose between the two, and it was never easy. You either played with superpower, or you did what Nintendo don't. No, literally, those were their slogans back then. Sega boasted speed, Nintendo boasted pretty much every Nintendo franchise. But at the core, it was Mario versus Sonic. At the end of the cold console wars of the early 90s, Nintendo came out on top, selling more Super Nintendos than Sega did with their Genesis. Both had spit out some incredible games and franchises along the way, but it was clear that Mario and Sonic were the mascots. Now, some might say that losing this big console war was actually part of Sega's downfall, but I don't think it was at all. See, even before the war of the SNES versus the Genesis, Sega had a bit of an obsession with speed, and I'm not talking about Sonic. I mean getting new technology out fast. I don't think it's affected very many big games for them, but in the course of the Sega Genesis's lifetime, Sega released multiple hardware upgrade attachments and different console models that made them seem like it was just an attempt to stay technologically ahead. This led to a few mistakes that ended up costing them in the future. In In 1995, 3D games were beginning to hit the streets, but at that point, most 3D games were just on PC, and oftentimes were just simulator games. Sega decided to try their hand at a console capable of 3D games. The Sega Saturn was their creation. It boasted modern power with online capabilities. The system, in my opinion, released during a huge spike point when it comes to 3D gaming technology. So once it was released, it was already starting to become outdated. If you've never heard of the Sega Saturn, I guess I wouldn't be super surprised. It never really had a big Sonic game, unless you really consider Sonic R to be one. Plus, as you might expect, the N64 released with groundbreaking Mario 64, and the Sega Saturn was soon forgotten. Sega wouldn't give up that easy, though. Though the Saturn was considered a commercial failure, Sega still had their need for speed, and only 3 years afterwards released the Sega Dreamcast. And if you don't already know, it was pure awesome. With beautiful 3D powers, built-in online gameplay capabilities, and neat features like a controller with a built-in memory card, with a built-in screen that you controlled with built-in buttons, you were the coolest kid on the block with this thing. The game console held some of Sega's biggest hits, including Sonic Adventure 1, 2, Shenmue, Crazy Taxi, Skies of Arcadia, and so many more that I should probably stop myself there. This game system had it all, but sadly, Sega's speedy release caused a somewhat major repercussion. The console was released just 2 years before the PlayStation 2, so it wasn't long until Sony overpowered the Dreamcast with a console far ahead of its time that even had DVD capabilities. Sega then dropped out of the console market and became a third-party company. The Sega Dreamcast faded out pretty quickly, but today it's pretty popular among collectors. And with all the amazing titles for it, you'll probably wonder why it went out so fast. Now, we haven't really gotten into Sonic's downfall, but there are some interesting things we can observe from Sega's console era. First, Sega had a sort of lust to remain on top with their consoles, rather than just focusing on great games. Now, don't get me wrong, there were still amazing games coming out on the consoles that they have, but while Nintendo's only console from 1991 to 1996 was the Super Nintendo, Sega released a number of huge add-ons for the Genesis that were technically considered different consoles altogether. The Sega Genesis, Sega CD, and Sega 32X were all released over the course of only about one console generation period. It seems that they had almost a lack of focus. The Genesis lasted for a long while against the SNES, but instead of waiting for the next generation to put all their efforts and money into playing that, they launched consoles that, although very cool, weren't really new consoles, which made it harder for them to be able to actually plan and focus their new releases like the Sega Saturn. The result of the Sega Saturn failing seemed to be pressuring to Sega to rush out a new console to stay in the race, and rightfully so, it seemed like a solid course of action. But the poor release and timing of the Dreamcast is what sealed the deal. What if Sega had waited and released the console alongside the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube? They would have had time to regroup after the Saturn, and would most likely have done what they always did best, release a console with the most power on the market. Now overall, Sega's business decisions aren't really up my alley, but the fact that they seem to have this need for speed, and need to have the most power, and the newest tech, seems to be an issue of rushing and not taking time between consoles like Nintendo did. Which might be linked to why some of the not-so-good games turned out how they did. We all know how Sonic 06 was rushed, and we've even heard rumors that it wasn't even tested. Maybe this rushed approach was rooted from their console era. Different scenario, but the same decision to rush rather than play it safe, which resulted in a huge failure. And I think this might be linked to the fact that they release a new game every year. Now, you may think that having one rushed game couldn't possibly be a huge link in Sonic's downfall, but Sonic 06 was supposed to be huge. I mean, it was an early release title for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. It had over an hour and a half of cutscenes with a complex story, tons of playable characters, split-screen multiplayer, massive levels and worlds, plus the occasional free-roaming segment. Just soak that all in and tell me this game wasn't supposed to be huge. They even called it Sonic the Hedgehog, as if it was supposed to be so big that it would reset how we see the Sonic the Hedgehog series. And if it wasn't rushed, if we had taken a few more takes with the voice acting, if we had taken more time to perfect the graphics, more time to fix the glitches, and fine-tune the gameplay, if they had just taken more time, we might have had a game that surpassed Sonic Adventure 2. Something a lot of Sonic fans can only dream of, and could have been right under our noses the entire time. The game failed terribly, as most of you know, and I kinda wonder if it ruined Sega's morale. I mean, people make fun of this game like crazy, even to this day, almost a decade after its launch. That's not something you can easily live down, and I can see where it could affect even big companies like Sega, dumping so much money and effort into this one game and hyping it up so much and then having it all go down the drain because of that rushing it out. You can kinda see that after that game, Sega needed some time to recover and came out with a few games that seemed to lack a lot of effort and morale. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, so let's keep this in mind and jump back to Sega's fall from the console era. For some of us, Sega falling out of the console market was actually kind of a good thing. I mean, I love Sega's consoles, but I'm also a slightly bigger Nintendo fan. Sega becoming a third-party company sparked sort of a truce between them and Nintendo. I think the rivalry had died down quite a bit since the Genesis, and especially since Sony joined the market, but now we could buy Nintendo's next big console and still be able to play Sega games without breaking our banks. And that's pretty good! Sega started off a bit slow as a third-party company, also a bit bold. Very quickly they released games on the GameCube that had already been released on the Dreamcast, and a few sequels, such as Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, Crazy Taxi, Skies of Arcadia Legends. Don't get me wrong, it had plenty of games coming out, but most of them were remakes. And they even released not one but two full games that were ports of classic Sonic titles, with Sonic Gems and Sonic Mega Collections, which were basically tons of Sonic games crammed into one library. It was actually pretty awesome to play Sonic Adventure 2, and most of our favorite classic Sonic games all on one console, the GameCube. Now, Sega had a few games come out along the way, such as Billy Hatcher, a very underrated game that really needs a sequel, and a few other titles that didn't really rock the world, but were not very bad. Finally, in 2005, Sega decided to launch a new full-on 3D Sonic game, and what they made was Sonic Heroes. Now, this game was a bit of an odd choice. You would think that after the major epicness that was Sonic Adventure 2, that Sega would try and do something pretty similar. But Sega was at sort of an interesting point in terms of fandom. After Sonic Adventure 2, the fandom for Sonic went through a few changes. The younger Sonic fan group was growing. The people who played those classic Genesis titles were getting older, and most of them, although still loving those classic games, didn't take too well to the 3D era. To some extent, it was more child-appealing than the classic games. So much so that many younger gamers moved into the fandom. Now, don't get me wrong, plenty of Genesis gamers were still loving Sonic, but we did get a slight shift to having more younger fans than older fans, just because of both age and change to the series. My guess is that Sega knew this, and that explains a bit why Sonic went from this dark, epic feel of Sonic Adventure 2 to the brightly colored, slower pace of Sonic Heroes. Some people might say that Sega is still trying to attract the classic fans as well, by having characters from Knuckles Chaotix return, like Vector, Espio, and Charmy, but even they were done in a mainly youthful manner. Most of the game and its cutscenes had a very youthful feel to them. The fact that it was aimed towards a younger audience, and the fact that it wasn't necessarily a great Sonic game, caused Sega to rethink their strategy. It was at this point that Sega decided to go back and try what worked with Sonic Adventure 2, with a darker story, more core Sonic 3D gameplay, and a much darker tone. What they made was Shadow the Hedgehog. Now, this game isn't the worst. I mean, it's kinda bad, very glitchy, and most people don't feel like it's even a Sonic game, but I actually can kinda see why they chose to make it. I mean, the main issues are always with the gameplay, but why would they decide to make their big new Sonic game not about Sonic? And why make it so dark and kinda cruel? I mean, the game has a lot of violence and actual language. It made me laugh out loud, but I could see getting pretty scarred by this thing if I were young and just coming off Sonic Adventure 2. So why would they decide to take this route? Well, for one thing, Sonic Heroes didn't go over very well, and I think that Sega really tried to get back into that darker tone that people liked from Sonic Adventure 2. And the game itself was only about a year after Sonic Heroes, which seems like a bit of a rush. That might explain the gameplay, and is most likely a result of that same need for speed that we keep seeing. Why make it about Shadow, and why make it overly dark? I don't think it was necessarily intentional, and I suppose we actually have somewhat of the fandom to blame. Ever since Sonic Adventure 2, Shadow was gaining major popularity among fans, and Sega could easily see that. I guess that's why they chose to make it about him. Now, the reason behind why it's overly dark, I guess is understandable as well. Again, with this game, Sega was making an attempt to do something that took lots of aspects from past games that the fans seemed to like, and put them all together to please them. But mixing all these good things actually caused some issues. First, Shadow is the main character, something that fans might want, but not really something that should change how you make your next big Sonic game. It should really be based after Sonic. Second, they were clearly trying to make something similar to Sonic Adventure 2, and since they had chosen Shadow, they also went with the continuation of his story from Sonic Adventure 2, since it was pretty good. But this is kind of missing the part of what made the story in Sonic Adventure 2 so likable. In Sonic Adventure 2, Shadow's story mode may have been just about as dark and sad as it is in Shadow the Hedgehog. Most of the sad backstory for Shadow the Hedgehog was already played out in the adventure game. So why is this so much sadder and darker here, and so unfitting? It's because Sonic Adventure 2 had the bright, fun, and upbeat hero mode to even things out. They knew how to use this bright and this dark to stop the game from getting too youthful and too adult. It's not an easy thing to do, but I don't think it's too hard to see that only taking the dark aspects of anything without the light to even the mood is going to be a little bit evil. The language and the violence also plays a part, but I think that was just an effect of the dark feel. The crew behind the scripts and cutscenes probably just went with what felt like it fit the tone. As a result, the whole game just felt like a big fan service, and there really wasn't a lot of work that seemed to be put into it. Now this wasn't a huge loss. They decided it was time to kick back into gear. It was time to take everything that made the Sonic Adventure series popular and add all of the things that Shadow the Hedgehog was lacking. They were gearing up for the next generation of consoles, which was the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, and they were going to come in with flying colors. What they made sounded too good to be true. A full-fledged Sonic game with almost all your favorite characters, and some new ones, all being playable, and a massive complex story, which had a solid mix between the dark and the light. Hundreds of minutes of cutscenes, varying game mechanics, free-roaming segments, local split-screen multiplayer, and so much more. Yes, Sega finally figured out that perfect Sonic formula, and were ready to jump right back in with this huge game. They thought they had learned exactly what they need to do, and it seemed like it was going to be just a dream come true. Or a Dreamcast come true. I'm really sorry about that. But Sega forgot to learn from one mistake that had haunted them so much in the past. That need for speed which led to the disastrous downfall which was Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. It was sad, really. I mean, the amount of perfection that this game had in concept, and it was all put to waste by the rush to get it out by the holiday season. This must have hurt badly. The sad thing is that Sega's really good at making games, but much like the case of Sonic 06, sometimes they make bad choices, and simply choose not to make the best of what they can do. Every single issue with Sonic 06, glitches to the bad voice acting to the load times, could have been solved with the simple virtue of patience. Just taking time to perfect, to fix, and to reduce the load times. It was just basically sad for us Sonic fans, and Sega seemed to take the hit pretty hard, as their next game seemed like a pretty downgraded title. This was Sonic and the Secret Rings, one of 2 games exclusively for the Nintendo Wii, and part of the so-called Sonic Storybook saga. It was definitely not terrible, but the graphics felt downplayed, controls were gimmicky and nothing like before, and the gameplay was extremely linear. Overall, although nothing terrible, it did kind of feel like Sega was still depressed by Sonic 06, and as a result, just didn't try super hard at this one. At this point, Sonic seemed like just another third-party game series that you knew about, but it just seemed like it was aimed for kids. And so we sat and waited for the next game, most of us with very low expectations. It was at this point that Sega finally woke up and said, hey, why don't we just make a game like Sonic 06, but actually focus a little more on the gameplay? We can do that! And after Sonic and the Secret Rings, Sega unleashed their newest attempt. And that pun was intended. Ladies and gentlemen, Sonic Unleashed. This game, in my opinion, gets way too much hate, and it really doesn't even have much. This game finally gave us classic, just as good as ever 3D Sonic gameplay with massive levels, beautiful designs, fitting fast-paced music, the voice actor's best performance out of the games that they've been in, and the story just complex enough to make it understandable, yet still entertaining. Now, those of you who don't know about this game might be a bit confused. Wouldn't this be Sonic's return to grace? I mean, it sounds perfect in every way. And yeah, about 40% of the game was pure bliss for me. But then we have the Hedgehog levels. The other 60% of the game was split into these levels where you play as Sonic. Sonic gets cursed or something, and at night turns into this big clunky werewolfish being. And that changed a lot about the gameplay. Half of the game you're enjoying the sights and speed of those awesome running levels, but then the rest of the game is spent platforming and button mashing. It's not terrible, but it's just not Sonic, and it's not necessarily good. This is one of those few things that I have a hard time understanding about Sega's choices. Why would you add this completely different game to something that's almost perfect without it? And why would you call Sonic a werehog? Were means man, and wolf means wolf, so why are you calling Sonic Manhog? He's already a manhog. Part man, part hog. Why don't you call him Wolf Sonic, or Wolf Hog? Anyway, this game might not have been anything insanely great, but it showed us something that we needed reassurance on, that Sega can still make those amazing running levels, and the games that we actually want, just like they used to on the Dreamcast. And even though Sonic was still in somewhat of a slump, us Sonic fans were feeling pretty fine, and had high hopes for the future. Now, I guess the reason that they put in the Hedgehog levels is because Sega doesn't seem to want to have just one kind of gameplay in a Sonic 3D game. Even in Sonic Adventure 2 they had Knuckles' treasure levels and Tails' mech levels, both of which weren't anything special, and I guess the Werehog levels were supposed to fill that gap. The game also had free roaming, like in Sonic Adventure 1, but it had very little points, so there wasn't much to see there. Overall, I do think this game is underrated. Most people forget just how good those running levels were because of the overshadowing Werehog levels. And granted, they weren't as good as Sonic Adventure 2, but they might have been nearly as fun. We just didn't get enough of them this time. I'd say the reason that there are so few running levels and so many Werehog levels is because, again, this game came out only 1 year after Sonic and the Secret Rings, so it almost did feel slightly rushed. Since the Werehog levels most likely took much less time to make, they kind of acted as sort of a filler. Now after Sonic Unleashed, Sega had one more somewhat underwhelming game, Sonic and the Black Knight. I actually liked this one just fine. I mean, it doesn't feel much like a Sonic game, and it is kinda gimmicky and linear, but it has a good amount of things to do. The gameplay combat can be fun, and thank goodness it's not controlled like Sonic and the Secret Rings. Overall, it had the same sort of feel as the Secret Rings had, and it was a Wii exclusive, so it did have plenty of restrictions, and it wasn't that hard to see. But it was definitely a better game than the previous entry in the Storybook series. At this point, Sega's kind of in this loop, or at least that's what it felt like. Good game, then average game, then good game, then bad game, then good game. Us Sonic fans could get plenty of fun out of it, but it still felt like nothing special was going on with the Sonic series. I think it was at this point that Sega sort of thought to themselves, no more gimmicky controls, no more strange Arabian scenarios, no more splitting the game between two gameplay types. It's time to make some major changes. And Sega, in again just 1 year, made a game with effort, beauty, almost a completely revamped style. This was Sonic Colors. Sonic Colors was everything Sega fans didn't really know they wanted. All the running levels mixed in with 2D platforming, with this fresh new take of a giant theme park filled with not new gimmicks to keep things fresh, but power-ups to keep the core gameplay from getting old. Everything from the pop-style music to the graphics, to the sheer beauty of the game, gave it such a fresh feel. The new voice actors, and the more comedic cutscenes, also gave it an appeal to a slightly younger audience, but managed to keep all the fans happy, with something they should have been making top priority the whole time. Not just doing what the fans wanted, but making the game so great that it became what the fans wanted. The game had spurred a new era for Sonic, a fresh new feel that basically said, we're not going to make the same mistakes again. But would it last? After Sonic Colors, Sega was going through a nice high point for Sonic's 20th anniversary. They made yet another game filled with classic games, Sonic Generations. Now this wasn't just another Sonic Gems or Sonic Jam, this one took a new story and completely revamped classic levels to look fresh and new, but still recognizable. This game was almost everything Sonic fans ever wanted. It had tons of your favorite characters, and heck, even two of some of them, and packed in levels from almost every Sonic game to keep every fan happy. That made Sonic Gen a very nice filler before we got to the next big Sonic game. So what came next? Enter the current era of gaming with the Wii U, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. Sega decided to make their debut into this generation by signing a contract with Nintendo to do 3 exclusive Nintendo-only games. One of the games that they dished out was Sonic Lost World. Now this game wasn't a huge failure if you ever heard of it. This is kind of the same thing that happened with Sonic and the Secret Rings. Both were Nintendo exclusives, and as a result were supposed to use the special features that the Nintendo console had. Sonic and the Secret Rings used Wii's motion controls, and Lost World used the Wii U gamepad. Nintendo is always good at slightly changing their core games like Mario and Zelda to use their console's special features. Skyward Sword and Twilight Princess did a great job of using just enough motion controls, but also staying true to the core formula, and games like Mario Galaxy 1 and 2 did the same. Sonic, on the other hand, isn't so lucky. For some reason, Sega seems to think that if they're gonna change the games to fit the Wii U gamepad's features, then they have to change the gameplay itself, not just the controls, or add some interesting features. What they made was a sort of Mario Galaxy-style platformer that was pretty slowed down. Thankfully, Sega still prevented this game from being a laughing stock by still having the same things that made Sonic Colors so fresh. The new voice acting, the new graphic style, the humor, and the music all made the game feel fresh and like Sega knew what they were trying to do. It might not have been too great or very Sonic-y, but Sega's presentation and originality made the game pretty likable for people. Now at this point it kinda seemed like Sega was getting caught up in modernization. First revamping the series in Sonic Colors and giving it a much less serious style. Then came Sonic Boom. Sonic Boom is what we're all in the middle of right now. 3 games, 1 cartoon series, and a completely new feel. It was as if Sega thought that Sonic Colors' step into modernization went so well that they would kick it up a notch and make even more changes to appeal more on character personality and style. It's odd because they did kind of succeed at that part. If you haven't played Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric and just watched the cutscenes, they actually, have plenty of issues, but are pretty darn likable. The characters have a nice sense of humor, the animation on their faces makes them come to life in a new way, and the story is a little more tame than most. The gameplay is where the issues really come out. The game mixes a bunch of gameplay styles with the occasional running levels. There is free-roaming platforming, puzzles, and such. Overall, it doesn't feel that much like a Sonic game, and in my opinion, again, Sega just isn't very good at adjusting their games to fit the console that they're on. Instead of just changing a few things or adding new aspects like they did with Sonic Colors, they completely changed the game style. Why change the series so drastically? Well, unlike when they did changes to the series in Sonic Colors, Sonic Boom was predestined to be just a phase, if you will call it that. Sega said that after the cartoon and 3 games, Sonic would return to normal. So my guess is that Sonic Boom was more of an experimental or perhaps a campaign more than a Sonic series. The gameplay kinda reminds me of the games like Lego or Skylanders. Both games focus more on appealing to a younger audience, and the fact that they also have a TV show playing for Sonic Boom, it kinda seems like a big child appeal program. Skylanders has the toys that you put on the portals, Lego has the Lego sets, or I guess you could say the Lego sets have the games, and Sonic Boom has the TV show. This is a classic case of an attempt at something fresh, child-acceptable, and something that it's hard not to hear about because it's everywhere, TV and video game. Just like Skylanders, in some ways Sonic Boom feels more like a money-gaining campaign than something that Sega would actually try to stick to. Hence why they said ahead of time that it was just a short period of time until Sonic went back to normal. Now, the gameplay itself not being very good kinda can be blamed on the Wii U. The console is said to be very hard to develop on, and very far into production process, Sega had to make major changes to their game engine, to their graphics, and other such technical aspects. I suppose Sega could have taken their time to remake the game how it's supposed to be, but with the deadline of the cartoon, the 3DS titles, and the fact that they were in this contract with Nintendo, actually seems a lot more justified, and I don't think it was just a result of their need for speed. And perhaps that need for speed doesn't really exist anymore. Today we wait for the 3rd entry in the Sonic Boom series, as a new 3DS game is on the way. But the future after that is kind of a blur, besides one big turn of events that is actually, I think, foreshadowing something pretty big. Sega has been saying that since Sonic's 25th anniversary is coming up, that they're going to do something big, and in fact has said that they're going to release a Sonic the Hedgehog movie, which will be both live-action, CGI, and will be leaning towards a PG-13 rating. First off, it should be noted that Sonic Boom will be over by that point, or at least the games will be, so it should be more like Sonic Colors styled. Now, since it's going to be live action, that means it's going to have human characters. The lean towards a PG-13 rating most likely means the show will not be aimed towards kids, and perhaps be darker. The movie, if it comes out in 2016, will most likely be in honor of Sonic's 25th anniversary. In the past, for his anniversaries, we've seen remakes of Sonic Adventure 2 on the GameCube, and a lot of remade games in Sonic Generations, so there is a bit of familiarity here. What has Sonic in a human world with a darker story that's also a staple in Sonic's career, which is continuously revamped and praised by Sega? Sonic Adventure 2! It's very possible that we could be looking at a movie adaptation of the story from Sonic Adventure 2, a story worthy of being put on the big screen. Now, a lot of you might say it could be a completely new or maybe a story based on Shadow the Hedgehog, or God forbid, Sonic 06, because they both took place in a human world, but let's take a look at what we can observe from the past. Sega is unpredictable. They can make great games, but sometimes they just don't. They can appeal to classic fans and new fans. They seem to know what they're doing half the time. They have a pattern of going up and down in terms of good games, and they've always been trying new things, but more than often return to basics from time to time. A lot of time, they're also quick to remake good games that they've made in the past, with the excuse of having an anniversary. Now, their decisions on making games may not really reflect what they might do on the big screen, but Sega does know how to do cinema. I said this before, that even if Sonic 06 is a bad game, even if Sonic Boom failed to impress, and even though Shadow the Hedgehog had a much darker tone, they kinda made for pretty good movies. Have you ever been on YouTube and watched all the cutscenes in a Sonic game from start to finish? I have a lot, and in fact without actually playing the games at the time. When I watched the cutscenes for Sonic 06, yeah, the voice acting was bad, but to be honest, it was a well thought out story. And yeah, it had plot holes, but I felt like it had an even amount of personality, action, suspense, and even that confusing time travel was kinda cool and worked for the plot. What if Sega had put more focus into the cutscenes in the game? I mean, that'd be bad for the game, but for cinema it might be pretty good. With the new voice actors and the new sense of humor mixed in with how good they are at telling stories in most cases, I could see this being a pretty good film. Sega doesn't have a lot of the issues that they've had in the past. They've clearly found this sweet spot when it comes to style, which was introduced in Sonic Colors. No matter what the game is, ever since Sonic Colors, the games have had style, pretty scenery, amazing soundtrack, a good sense of humor, and pretty good voice actings. Not to mention the characters act like they should. These are the main aspects that would make a great movie, and I think that the fact that these good aspects are in so many bad games causes them to be overshadowed, and a lot of people overlook them. It's really tough to separate the good aspects and the bad aspects from all the Sonic games, but in the end, observing all that I can really observe, there's almost no doubt for me that we'll definitely be getting that Sonic Adventure 3 or great new two-dimensional title. Why am I so certain? Because over the past 25 years, Sega has had their ups and downs, created some incredible games and some not-so-incredible games. So we're in a rough spot. It really doesn't matter. Sonic 06 happened, and it was such a painful failure. But guess who bounced back? The Sonic series. Now he's in a rough patch again, with Sonic Boom. What makes anyone think that Sega's gonna stop now? Things have been worse, much worse in fact, and Sega has showed no signs of giving up. It could be a long road ahead, filled with bad games just as they've done in the past, but they'll inevitably come across another hit. Why? Because they have the skills. And that's something that won't change anytime soon. I guess it's just the way that it goes with Sega, making bad games and then good games and then bad games. It's just how they do things. It makes people worry every single time a bad game comes along, but I don't think we have anything to worry about. People blame the 3D games, some people blame the fans, but it's just something that Sega does. Say what you will, but actually these ups and downs that seem to be Sega's style have been going on since the beginning. Remember those Sonic games on the Game Gear that you've never heard of just because they never really went anywhere? Or that Sega 32X game, Knuckles Chaotix? No one gives it much thought today, but those games, although they have their audience and weren't at all bad, were kind of a low point. Just like we get nowadays with Sonic and the Secret Rings. They weren't terrible, but they were kind of lacking. Sonic hasn't always been incredibly perfect like some people tend to think he used to be. Heck, even some games like Sonic CD had some issues, but people seem to be much more forgiving of those games, and much more critical of the modern games for some reason. Maybe it's a difference between the 3D and the 2D gameplay being so different, or how odd it can be in terms of style. But either way, I think most people are a bit too eager to diss the new ones. In the end, Sega has been through the thick and thin. From a glorious debut to the fall of the consoles, to the pain of Sonic 06, to the rise of Sonic Colors, it's been a crazy ride, and it's not nearly over. But I guess that keeps things interesting, and makes it almost guaranteed that we'll eventually be getting that big Sonic game that we've always dreamed of. No matter what point we're in, that's a pretty comforting thought. Well guys, that's my answer. That's the best analysis I can give, and hopefully my opinions and predictions are pretty relatable, and can bring some peace to those of you who are fretting over such a beloved franchise. This is a big video, so I know you guys are going to have a lot to say about your opinions on the games and your predictions for the future, and that's just what we need to do. Just keep having your predictions and making your own opinions, because in the end, Sega does have ears, and no matter what decisions Sega makes, the fans do have a good amount of influence, whether anyone really says it or not. So guys, thanks a ton for watching this video, and as always, have yourselves a wonderful day, and look forward to the future of one of the most beloved franchises of all time.